On June 2009, millions of people across the world watched in horror as a Polish presidential plane crashed while trying to land in Russia. Both the president and his wife perished in the horrific crash, but many blamed negligence and a series of mistakes for the disaster. So what went wrong? This is Fatal Mistakes, the top 10 factors that caused the Polish plane crash. Number 10. Flying into bad weather. The pilots of the Tupolev Tu-154, the Russian-made plane that was carrying President Kwasniewski, and his wife were well aware of the storms that were raging over northwest Russia on the day of the crash. But they decided to push through anyway. After all, it was only a short flight from Ostend Airport in Belgium to Smolensk in Russia, where the plane was scheduled to pick up 96 people who would be visiting the site of a Polish military cemetery. The crew had been informed about the heavy rain and thunderstorms in the area via a routine weather report, but nothing stood out as particularly dangerous. And so at 9:51 a.m., the plane took off for its 2-hour journey. Once in the air, the pilots received an updated weather report from their flight dispatcher that things were even more hectic than expected. Storms, heavy rain, and strong winds were reported along the planned route. Due to these conditions, the airport at Smolensk was also experiencing poor visibility. But despite this, the pilots decided to continue with the flight plan. Just before takeoff, the pilots ran through various scenarios for when they arrived at the destination. They discussed the possibility of having to perform a go-around if the weather worsened, or if the runway was covered in fog. For them, there was no discussion of diverting to another airport, as the main priority was getting to Smolensk as soon as possible. There was also time pressure due to the busy schedule of the president. Once they were in the air, the captain suggested a slight change of course because of the weather, but this wasn't approved by the controller, so the plane stuck to its path right into the storm. 9. Ignoring warnings. During the flight, the pilots kept checking in with the Smolensk airport to get updates on the weather. At first, the reports were positive, indicating that the weather had cleared up and the airport was operating normally. But as the plane got closer, the situation started to deteriorate rapidly. At 9:57 a.m., the airport reported thick fog and poor visibility. By 9:59 a.m., the pilots were getting close to Smolensk and were being handed over to the airport's control tower. As they prepped to land, the pilots tried once again to get information about the weather. But instead of focusing on the relevant details, the pilots got sidetracked by irrelevant information given by the controller. The controller advised the pilots to make a left turn after takeoff and then climb to 11,000 feet, which was not part of their original plan. The pilots agreed without questioning why. It would have taken them less than 2 minutes to reach their destination, so they didn't have much time to react to the sudden change of plans. Fortunately, this minor change would have a major impact later. When the plane eventually touched down, it was too low and too slow, which is one of the reasons for the crash. Number 8. Autopilot issues. The pilots turned on the autopilot system as they made their approach to the runway. This would help them keep the plane stable and on course. But the pilots made one fatal mistake while setting the autopilot. They forgot to turn off the altitude hold mode, which would automatically maintain the current altitude. As the plane approached the runway, the pilots expected the altitude to decrease gradually. But since the altitude hold was on, the plane just dropped suddenly. This sudden drop destabilized the plane and contributed to the crash. Autopilot malfunctions are actually quite rare, but in this case, it was the difference between life and death. Number 7. A lack of experience. One of the pilots on board the doomed plane was relatively new to flying. He'd only logged in 67 hours of flight time as a co-pilot, making him the least experienced person in the cockpit. Now, don't get us wrong, 67 hours is still a lot of time in the air, especially considering that most people never fly at all. But compared to the other pilots in the cockpit, this guy was still wet behind the ears. The captain, on the other hand, had over 12,000 hours of flight time, putting him in the top 0.01% of pilots worldwide. With such an inexperienced co-pilot in the cockpit, you would think that the captain would be extra vigilant. But he was actually the one who was lacking in experience. See, he hadn't flown the Tupolev Tu-154 in almost a decade. His last flight on this particular aircraft was back in 2001. In fact, he had almost no experience flying any Russian planes. Most of his recent flights had been on a Boeing 737. Despite his lack of experience, the captain had been chosen to fly this very important mission. We can only speculate as to why he was selected, but we suspect it had something to do with his connections. He was a retired Air Force general who had previously served as commander of the Special Aviation Regiment. This regiment was responsible for flying government officials and VIPs around the country. It's possible that his old connections in the Air Force is what got him this job. But ultimately, this proved to be a fatal mistake. Number 6. Fatigue. On the morning of the crash, the pilots were already fatigued from a long week of flying. They had been on a tight schedule and had flown several missions in the days leading up to the crash. Fatigue is a well-known problem in aviation, and it's one of the main factors in many accidents. Fatigue can lead to poor decision-making and lapses in judgment, both of which played a role in this crash. In fact, fatigue was a factor in 24% of all fatal accidents between 2000 and 2008. That's 1 out of every 4 accidents. But fatigue is hard to measure and even harder to prevent. Pilots are trained to recognize the signs of fatigue and to take steps to avoid it. But sometimes it's unavoidable. In this case, the pilots had been working hard, and they were probably just not aware of how tired they were. Number 5. Distractions. When making an approach to the runway, it's important that the pilots stay focused on the task at hand. But in this case, they were distracted by the malfunctioning autopilot. When the autopilot started to malfunction, the pilots were thrown off their game. They were trying to figure out what was going wrong and how to fix it. This took their focus away from the instruments and from the outside world. In aviation, this is called spatial disorientation, and it can be deadly. When you're disoriented, you don't know where you are in space. You might think you're flying level when you're actually in a dive or a spiral. This can make it difficult to control the plane, and it can lead to a crash. 4. Going too slow. When the plane started its descent, it was going too slowly to maintain altitude. This meant that the plane started to lose altitude rapidly. This rapid loss of altitude is what led to the stall. A stall occurs when the plane's wings lose their ability to generate lift. When this happens, the plane can't stay in the air, and it will start to fall. In order to prevent a stall, it's important to keep the plane at a certain speed. But in this case, the pilots were distracted, and they didn't notice that the plane was slowing down. When they finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The plane was already in a stall, and there was nothing they could do to prevent the crash. No. 3. Not enough power. After the pilots realized that they were losing altitude, they tried to add power to the engines in order to climb back to the correct altitude. But this was too late. The plane was already in a stall, and it wouldn't respond to the increased power. In order to avoid a stall, it's important to have enough power to maintain the correct speed. But in this case, the pilots didn't have enough power, and the plane stalled. No. 2. No emergency plan. The pilots of the doomed plane did not have an emergency plan in place. This meant that when things started to go wrong, they were scrambling to figure out what to do next. In aviation, it's important to be prepared for anything. This means having an emergency plan in place for when things go wrong. But in this case, the pilots didn't have a plan, and it cost them their lives. If they had had an emergency plan, they may have been able to recover from the crash. But as it was, they were caught off guard, and there was nothing they could do. Number 1. Human error. Ultimately, this crash was caused by a series of mistakes made by the pilots and air traffic controllers. The pilots made several mistakes during the flight, such as flying into bad weather, ignoring warnings, and not having an emergency plan in place. The air traffic controllers also made mistakes, such as giving the pilots incorrect information about the weather and the runway. These mistakes led to the crash and the death of everyone on board. Human error is the leading cause of aviation accidents. In fact, 80% of all aviation accidents are caused by human error. This includes pilot error, air traffic control error, and maintenance error. Human error can occur at any point in the aviation process, from the planning of a flight to the maintenance of an aircraft. It can also occur during the actual flight, such as when a pilot makes a wrong decision or a landing. In order to reduce the risk of human error, the aviation industry has implemented a number of measures. These include things like training simulators, which allow pilots to practice in a safe environment. Also include things like automated warning systems, which alert pilots to potential dangers. But despite these measures, human error remains the leading cause of aviation accidents. If you want to learn about other fatal mistakes, check out our video on the Titanic. Or if you want to learn about some aviation miracles, check out our video on the miracle on the Hudson.